Bed rotting is a term that's gotten a lot of traction on social media lately, and it typically refers to spending most, if not all, of your day, sometimes even multiple days in a row, in bed, awake and alert, but not doing things that are really physically or mentally demanding. And so when we're bed rotting, we're probably on our phones most of the day, possibly watching TV, possibly reading a book, but not trying to get ourselves to be productive. We're not in bed on our laptops, doing taxes or something like that. Essentially, bed rotting, which is just a colloquial term, by the way, this is not a clinical term. You won't find it in the DSM. It's not officially a symptom of anything. It's generally thought of as being like a break from life. So, bed rotting is typically described in positive terms as being sort of a vacation from the grind of productivity that we all live under. It's often described as a self care activity. As you can probably guess by the title of this video, I don't really align with that. I think there could be some value in certain scenarios in some of the behaviors that are ascribed to bed rotting, but the way I've seen it done and the way I've seen people encouraged to do it is something that I have significant concerns about as it relates to your mental health. So this video basically is going to be split up into two sections. I'm going to share my concerns with overusing bed rotting as a coping tool. And if it's something you're struggling with, I'm going to give you some strategies to try to break out of this pattern. Before I critique bed rotting, though, let me start by saying I get it. I understand what a grind this life can be. And I know a lot of us are out there working very hard, day in and day out, with little reward, little to no immediate gratification, and maybe the faint promise that at some point, sometime in the future, things get better. That's hard. That's depressing, that's frustrating, that's demoralizing, and I completely understand why sometimes you wake up and you say, you know what, I'm just not really up for that today. I've been there myself, especially in grad school. I had multiple long periods of time where I questioned every single thing I was doing and largely considered restarting and throwing everything away. Days start to run together, everything starts to look kind of gray, and we have, at least in America, we have this hustle culture, right? This grind mentality, this constant pressure to be productive in some way or another, even when we're not on the clock at our jobs. It is absolutely draining. And we do need ways to break out of this. Being in that mindset 24/7 is not good for probably 99% of people. There is a very, very small subset of people who thrive under those conditions. Most of us do not. So I understand that we need breaks, we need variety, we need novelty. These are very real human needs that our current social structure does not do a great job of setting up for us or even encouraging us to meet. That being said, I don't believe that most bed rotting practices are an effective way to meet these needs. The main reason is we need to be able to assess whether we are physically exhausted or mentally exhausted. Laying in bed all day and not forcing yourself to do anything could be a very good way to recover from physical exhaustion. It is not going to be very effective in recovering from mental exhaustion because the way we recover from mental exhaustion isn't by doing nothing. It is by doing something that isn't stressful. In order to get a break from stress and pressure, your brain needs to be occupied by stimulating, engaging, novel things that don't have a lot of performance or productivity expectations attached to them. And so if you're laying in bed all day, just kind of passively watching things in very short bursts, many of which are not necessarily very interesting to you, what you will probably find is that your brain isn't super occupied by those things, and it probably drifts back frequently to stressors and problems and challenges, and maybe even negative thoughts about yourself like failure or worthlessness. And frankly, your brain will probably use the fact that you're laying in bed, quote, doing nothing to actually strengthen these negative belief systems. So if you're already feeling like I'm not going where I want to be in life, things are not going the way I'd like to, and you have that kind of negative voice in your head, and I'm saying it like it's a separate part of you. I know it's not. This is just like metaphorical, but it sees you laying in bed all day. What do you think it's going to say to you? It's not going to be kind to you. It's just going to use that as another way to guilt you and shame you and reinforce the beliefs you're already struggling with. It's also something that can easily become very habit forming. We are very like routine and momentum based creatures, and our general tendency or natural pull every day is going to be to live today pretty much the same way we lived yesterday. So if you have a whole day where you don't challenge yourself at all and don't make yourself do anything, you're probably going to wake up the next day feeling somewhat of a desire to do the same thing, which essentially is nothing. And this can create what I call a false depression, where you start to experience some of the physical and psychological symptoms of a depressive episode, not because your brain chemistry is actually being altered by a mental illness, but because you, with all due respect, this is not meant to be shaming, I'm just describing things, you are living your life in a way that feels depressing. There's nothing happening in your day that gives you the opportunity for reward or achievement or self esteem or even really joy beyond just like momentary seconds of entertainment, really. And we are very momentum based creatures. Human beings kind of follow Newton's first law, which is that an object in motion tends to stay in motion and an object at rest tends to stay at rest. So we start to create these really self perpetuating negative habits that then are difficult to break out of. Another thing about rest and self care is that when you take a break from life, when you take a break from stress, the efficacy of that break will plateau. So if you're having a hard day, you're having a stressful day, and you step away for 20 minutes, maybe you go outside and take a little walk or like lay down on your couch and just chill for a little bit, there's a certain amount of time, a certain duration of time to where you will start to feel better from that activity. But you'll kind of hit a limit with it at some point. Eventually, you will have gotten everything you're going to get from that break. And if you just continue indefinitely on that break, you don't get additional relief. You hit a wall pretty quickly. So if you're bed rotting all day long, it may be beneficial for some finite amount of time. After that, you're just coasting. You're not getting additional stress relief. You're not getting an additional break. You've gotten all you can get from it. And it's time to move on. And if we're still stressed out, if we need something else, we need to seek out other ways. We need to seek out our next step to get that. Bed rotting is also likely going to negatively impact your sleep cycle. When you're laying in bed all day and A, not getting out of bed, B, not using your body, you might find that by the time your normal bedtime rolls around, you don't really feel tired. You have a hard time falling asleep. You lose your sense of time. Your brain gets kind of confused about how much time has passed because a lot of times we use activities as our time markers. And so if your day hasn't really had much activity, sometimes it gets to, whatever time you go to bed, 10 o'clock, midnight, and your brain still kind of feels like it's like 3 p.m. because all your normal time markers did not occur on that particular day. And when we get into poor sleep cycles, that worsens our mental health and reduces our ability to deal with stressors, which makes us more likely to need breaks from our stressors. And so that can easily become a self perpetuating cycle. My last concern that I'm going to share about bed rotting is if you're a person watching this and you have one or more chronic mental health conditions, if you have mood disorders, anxiety disorders, PTSD, this is hard to hear, I know, but it's something I say a lot and it's something I'm going to keep saying because it's important for you to hear it. We need to play by different rules because a person who gets overwhelmed by stress and overwhelmed by burnout or their work or whatever it is can probably take a day off and then like jump back into it the next day and be all right. But if you're someone who's prone to cyclical or episodic emotional regulation issues, sometimes that day where everything just stops and you don't do anything and you're just in your head all day long, sometimes that day can be the start of a vicious downward spiral. I have seen it happen. You may have seen it happen. You may have felt it happen. It's very important when we have a chronic mental health condition or multiple chronic mental health conditions to take excellent care of ourselves. And despite what you might see on social media, bed rotting is not self care. It isn't because you're actually neglecting a lot of your basic needs when you engage in bed rotting. Your nutrition probably isn't great. It's mostly snacking all day. You're getting virtually no physical activity in. It screws up your sleep hygiene. You're probably not staying connected socially. You're probably not engaging with a lot of people. These are your self-care needs. And so when you neglect them to, quote, do nothing, you're not actually practicing self-care. You're practicing avoidance. And avoidance is not self care. Ultimately, this is a question everybody just has to answer for themselves because we all have different brains, we all have different lives, we all have different goals. Ask yourself how you feel afterwards. If after a bed rotting episode, if you feel refreshed and rejuvenated and ready to get back out there, if you feel like you did just take a vacation, awesome. You have found a strategy that works for you. I'm not trying to tell you you're wrong if that's your genuine experience. But if it's not your genuine experience and you found that you actually feel worse after a day of laying in bed, then you just need to be honest with yourself that this is not a self care activity. This is actually an avoidance strategy. If you align with some of these concerns I've raised about bed rotting, and you find yourself thinking, I would like to try to work on this, I want to get out of this cycle that I'm in, I don't necessarily want to be bed rotting all day long, I have 6 strategies I'm going to share with you that I think will help you get out of this pattern. You should approach this with a plan. And so if you say, I'm just going to bed rot, like with no time frame or no marker for when you know that you're ready to be done, it just sort of becomes this amorphous, non-specific thing. And I really, really don't think that's good for us. So we just have to define it. We have to set either a timeline or some way of knowing when we're done and we're ready to get back out in the world. So, number one strategy, this one might sound weird in the context of what I just said in the last several minutes. Stop shaming yourself for bed rotting. It's so easy for us to get into these self perpetuating cycles where the way we cope with our maladaptive choices makes us feel worse about them, which then makes us need to use them more. So, any avoidance strategy or any quote unhealthy coping strategy is usually a response to high negative emotions. You feel something inside of you that is difficult to deal with, and you use something really strong or really extreme to cope with that feeling. Shame is an unpleasant emotion. And so the more shame you experience, the more of a pull you will probably feel to use stronger coping strategies. So if you shame yourself for bed rotting, what do you think is going to happen? You're probably going to feel like doing it again because now you have one more reason to feel like crap about yourself. So I want to encourage you to try to validate what was going on in your life. What were you feeling and how have things been for you? Try to understand with every ounce of brain power that you have why you felt the way you did and why you made the choices that you did. Think of it like if you're laying in bed because you're having a really hard day, imagine yourself being a teenager, right? And a parent comes into the room and they see you laying in bed and they do, the stereotypical parent thing, call you lazy, this isn't going to work. You need to get your butt out of bed. You need to go get back out there into life. In the history of humanity, has making someone feel bad for the things they do when they feel bad ever helped the person stop doing those things? I don't know what the success rate of that technique is. It's not high. It may be zero. I have never seen that work. You can't stop feeling bad by feeling worse. It doesn't work. So try to understand and validate your feelings rather than shaming yourself for it. It makes sense that I needed a break from life because I have been working 60 hours a week for 3 months, or I have a disabled child who is difficult to deal with sometimes, or I'm in grad school and grad school is a freaking nightmare, or I have no money and that's incredibly stressful, right? I mean, fill in the blanks, right? Life is hard. And you need to understand that. And so you can understand yourself when you feel this way, instead of just acting like you don't get it, acting like you have no reason to feel the way you do, and expecting yourself to just bootstrap yourself out of bed. Doesn't work that way. Number two strategy, set a screen time limit. Because again, most of the time we're bed rotting, we're on screens. You're probably not just going to lay in bed all day with literally no stimulation because that would absolutely drive you nuts. And so, a good way to limit the amount of time you'll be in bed is to limit the amount of time you'll be on your screen. If that's your phone, put a screen time limit on it. If it's your TV, put your sleep timer on, just as a prompt to remind you, hey, this is the amount of time you said you were going to do this. You gave it to yourself. You made a request and you granted the request. Now it's time to go do something else. We've hit that plateau. We've gotten everything we're going to get from this. And now we need to try other coping strategies to reach our next level of stress reduction. Another note on that, I guess 2 and 3 are kind of combined if I'm being honest, but take breaks. I think a good ratio would be 90 to 30. In other words, let yourself do nothing for 90 minutes. And at the end of 90 minutes, make yourself get up and go do something for 30 minutes. So you got this total 2 hour block and it's 75-25, bed rotting versus doing something. And at the end of that 2 hour block, reassess. If you feel pretty good at that point, maybe you got what you need from bed rotting, and maybe now you're ready to go do your life again. If you still feel very distressed, very burnt out, very at the end of your rope, give yourself another 2 hour block. Get back in bed for 90 minutes, do what you were doing before, and then at the end of it, get out for another 30, go wash dishes or go for a walk or call a friend, play a video game that's not on your phone. Just do something that isn't in bed. And at some point, I think you'll find that you are able to identify that you got what you needed from it and you're ready to move on. The fourth technique is to practice something called opposite to emotion. This is a skill from dialectical behavior therapy, or DBT, and opposite to emotion involves basically treating the behavioral impulses that you can identify come from a place of depression or anxiety or other mental health condition as being guides for what not to do. Because if you do the things you want to do when you're depressed, you get more depressed. If you do the things you want to do when you're anxious, you get more anxious. And I believe that a lot of bed rotting behavior probably actually comes from mental illness rather than just overwhelming stress and burnout. I'm sure there's some of both, and it doesn't have to be either or, of course, those things can combine. But think of it this way. If I asked you to plan a day where you could screw up your mental health as badly as possible and make your life as bad as possible, what would you plan to do? I mean, other than, truly ridiculous things like go spend all my money or like, burn my house down or something. If it was like a more normal answer, you'd probably say, well, probably the worst thing I could do is lay in bed all day and do nothing. Like that's really probably the worst thing we can do for our mental health. Because then you have nothing. You have no evidence on that day that you can use to challenge your negative thoughts. There's no real prompt for joy or reward or achievement or other sources of dopamine. There's probably little to no connection with other people. It's the worst of everything. And so if you practice that opposite to emotion when you feel this urge and you say, okay, this urge comes from a mental illness, therefore I'm going to do the opposite of it so that I feel less of my mental health symptoms rather than more of them. Just that simple prompt. It's basically that inversion thinking that I've talked about on this channel before. Just that prompt, that question and that answer can help you identify what to do instead of what you feel like doing. My fifth idea is to set one or more goals for yourself on that day. I just don't think it's good for us to have a day with 0 goals. Can it be good to have a day with like fewer than 30 goals when we normally have a massive to-do list? Absolutely, yes. But I don't think going to the complete opposite end of the spectrum and having none is the answer. Because setting and achieving goals is part of what activates our reward system, part of what activates our dopamine pathway. And when that dopamine pathway is not firing, that tends to have negative implications for our mood and for our mental health. Set small goals on these days. On the days when you're really up against it, don't expect yourself to do all your normal things. Absolutely take some things off the agenda. Keep a few basic self-care things on it though. Like maybe you do some light stretching or mobility work, or maybe you spend a little bit of time doing some mindfulness practice or staying engaged with your spiritual practices. Keep a few things on it. Keep 3 or 4 relatively light and simple things on your to-do list. Because when you set those goals and you accomplish those goals, it gives you a little bit of that adrenaline, right? And that's what gives you motivation to want to do more things and probably what will eventually get you out of bed. If you plan to do nothing and you do nothing, it's just so easy to get stuck in the mud of that, and it's very, very difficult to get out. And the last thing, the sixth idea, is to try to stay socially connected to some extent. I know that when we're really stressed and burnt out, sometimes relationships are a part of that. And keeping up with the people in our lives, relationships can be stressful, especially if you're more on the introverted side of things. People are stressful. People wanting things from you, needing things from you, even just wanting to talk to you can be stressful sometimes. So again, absolutely take a break from that. It's typically not good to go all the way to the end though and just isolate ourselves for long periods of time. That's another prompt. It leaves another opening for a lot of the darker thoughts to creep in. I'm a loser. Nobody loves me. No one wants to be with me. Even if it's you pulling away from them, somehow that doesn't always stop our brains from thinking those things, does it? Our brains are not always as logical or rational as we'd want them to be. So try to keep some minimal level of social connection when you're bed rotting. Whether that's texting, whether it's FaceTiming, even online gaming on your phone. completely withdrawing from society just doesn't usually turn out well for us, especially those of us with things like social anxiety, for example. That's my whole take on the bed rotting thing. Hopefully that makes sense to you guys. Hopefully some of this helps. Please let me know in the comments if it did. I'd love to see you again if you're not a subscriber. Take care, and I'll see you next time.